Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Pond's mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman. And together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You'll find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at doingsofdoyle.com on Blue Sky. Hello and welcome to episode 63. This episode we travel to the northernmost tip of Scotland, where one man's solitude is interrupted by two mysterious castaways in The Man from Archangel from 1885. And here's Paul to set the scene.
Having come into an unexpected inheritance, the morose and misanthropic John McVittie is able to give up his unrewarding legal practice in the English Midlands and retire to a remote coastal estate at Caithness in eastern Scotland. Here he pursues his esoteric, scientific and philosophical interests, with only his aged housekeeper for company. But his quiet existence is disrupted when a Russian schooner is wrecked in a storm, and McVittie rescues a young woman from the doomed ship. Apparently, however, she is not the only survivor, as shortly afterwards McVittie discovers that his lonely house is under observation from a mysterious bearded stranger.
And for those who haven't read the story, we heartily recommend that you do, because we're going to be a little spoilerific on this one, and we don't want to disappoint you by revealing the ending. So, Conan Doyle probably wrote The Man from Archangel in late 1884 while he was in medical practice in Southsea, and he was very prolific that year. Other short stories included The Bloodstone Tragedy, which we covered in episode 55, John Barrington Cowles in episode 56, also The Cabman Story, The Tragedians, and Crabbe's Practice. He was also busy contributing articles to the likes of the British Journal of Photography and The Lancet, and at the same time was trying to get himself established as a figure in local civic life. So he'd become a member of the Portsmouth Literary and Scientific Society, through which he was exploring spiritualism, of which there are a few echoes in this story. And he was also busy trying to drum up business for his medical practice, which he parodied and pastiched in the aforementioned Crabbe's Practice later in that year. It was also in 1884 that he met his first wife, Louise Hawkins, and in around October 1884, as he was trying to get more established locally, he became a founding member of Portsmouth Football Club, for whom he played in goal, albeit under the pseudonym of A.C. Smith, presumably to protect his respectability. Now, The Man from Archangel found its way into the pages of London society, but we do wonder if it was ACD's first choice of publication. The editor of London Society, James Hogg, had been a steadfast patron of Conan Doyle since 1880, and he'd strongly encouraged him to go into writing full-time. But by 1885, Conan Doyle had significantly branched out. In 1880-81, he only appeared in the pages of London Society, but in 1884, his stories appeared in 5 different periodicals, and one of the ones that probably is likely as a contender is in fact his old favourite, the Cornhill.
Yeah, he'd actually breached the walls of the Cornhill in 1884 with quite a success, really. J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, his Mary Celeste story, which had been published anonymously, but had really been picked up on, and had even been mistaken for the work of Robert Louis Stevenson, which must have delighted him. Having once been in the Cornhill, he was determined to keep trying and get in again. And he wrote in a letter to his mother at this time, "I am continually sending things to Cornhill, and they send them back with a perseverance worthy of a better cause. I hope, however, that during the winter I may force my way once more into the charmed circle. I assure you it is not for want of trying. So I'm pretty certain that he would have tried with the man from Archangel, and
Yeah.
it's probably one of those that came back.
Yes.
And so the London Society very much second or third choice on this one, I'm quite sure.
Yeah, that would make perfect sense. So it did eventually make its way into London Society in January 1885, and it was first anthologized then in 1889, but not by Conan Doyle, but by James Hogg, the editor of London Society, who produced Mysteries and Adventures, a collection of Conan Doyle's work in London Society, which he printed without Conan Doyle's permission, and much to his great annoyance. And Conan Doyle got his own back by then including The Man from Archangel and other London Society stories in his first official anthology, The Captain of the Pole Star and Other Tales, in March 1890. And there is a footnote to this story in that Adrian Conan Doyle said that this was one of the stories that his father considered to be a favourite, which was a note he put into his pamphlet, The True Conan Doyle, from 1945. So that's one of the questions that we'll be exploring today. Why did Conan Doyle apparently rate this one quite so highly?
Yeah, it's an interesting quote. That I mean, when I read The True Conan Doyle, it really leapt out at me. Because, I mean, the actual wording. As a footnote, I might mention that my father considered his finest piece of writing to be The Man from Archangel from his Tales of Adventure. His finest piece of writing. I've not heard any evidence of that elsewhere. I'm sure Doyle did rate it highly. Arthur Conan Doyle did rate it highly. But finest piece of writing, I don't know if this is the usual Adrian exaggeration.
Yeah.
And Adrian isn't always the most reliable of narrators, shall we say?
No.
Which is entirely fitting, considering the story itself, as we will go on to discuss. Unreliable narrators are really at the heart of it.
Yeah. That's very true. So let's get on to the story itself and start with that narrator, because this is not your normal Conan Doyle narrator. We're introduced to John McVittie, who's an attorney in the Midlands who has inherited money and land from his wealthy uncle, which has allowed him to leave his work and to pursue these abstruse scientific interests of his in isolation in the far north of Scotland. But he's as you said at the beginning, Paul, he's misanthropic, he's introspective, he's morally ambiguous. The character is very unusual for a Conan Doyle narrator, I'd say.
Yeah, in one way, but he's also fitting into a certain type of character at this time. In that we've got a number of stories which have that little square box in 1881. Has another one of these very grumpy characters, and Surgeon of Gaster Fell. We've got a similar-ish sort of character in there. Who wants to cut himself off from the human race, or should we use that line from My Fair Lady, from humanity's mad inhuman noise. So there's a bit of this going on, and Owen Dudley Edwards actually speculates that this, even though we're now at a phase where Conan Doyle's living in Southsea and starting to get his medical practice going, that this might be some memory of his Edinburgh days.
Yes.
And the chaos in some ways of the household, the Doyle household in Edinburgh. And numerous siblings are in there. Father's in and out of the house, Charles Doyle, because of his institutionalisation. And we've also got Brian Charles Waller, the cuckoo in the nest in the Edinburgh household. So there's all this noise going on all the time, and people, the house is pretty crowded there. And Owen speculates is this Doyle just wanting a bit of peace and quiet
maybe
on his own, and channeling that into these sorts of characters. But this one in particular is he's quite an unpleasant piece of work.
He is. I mean, it's interesting that the next narrator we get is the one in the lonely Hampshire cottage, and he's actually a villain. So we get kind of like the next extension of this to somebody who is actively on the wrong side of the law. Although this chap is singular for being thoroughly dislikable. We open with his journal entry from 1867. by him aged 25, which would have been the same age Conan Doyle was when he wrote this story. And it literally starts with a description of the universe and then hones in on him. And he does say, does call himself a mite like any other, but really he's kind of boosting his own importance. And there's a final sentence in that opening journal entry. I can still at times feel some degree of happiness, and am even, save the mark, puffed up occasionally with a sense of my own importance. I mean, he's incredibly pompous individual.
Oh, he's pompous throughout.
He is.
The whole thing, he's extremely pompous and pretentious.
Yes.
And again, when Owen is talking about this, he sees the comedy.
Yes. Oh, yes.
That this character is extremely funny.
Yeah. In
that he takes himself so seriously, and he's just he is a wonderful comic creation. But in a very different way. In a way, he's sort of leading the way towards Gerard later on, but in a very different way.
Yeah.
Because like Gerard, he lacks self-awareness.
Yes.
And doesn't understand in a way what an idiot he's appearing.
Yeah. I think there's also a bit of a darker side to him as well, isn't there?
Definitely.
There's definitely the introspection and the melancholy, but there's also, perhaps a sense that he's, it's not just us finding him quite unpleasant. I mean, when he wins the jackpot, he gets his money from his Uncle McVittie of Glencairn. He makes the point that the old man had bequeathed him a bleak tract of land upon the coast, which I think the old man must have bestowed upon me in derision, for it was sandy and valueless, and he had ever a grim sense of humour. But also, there is this very interesting line that he says that he had to leave the Midlands very quickly because he almost killed a man in anger.
My departure from my English home was somewhat accelerated by the fact that I had nearly slain a man in a quarrel, for my temper was fiery, and I was apt to forget my own strength when outraged. And I think there's an element of again autobiographical musings coming into this, because Doyle himself could have he was handy with his fists.
Yeah.
And first thing, when he first arrived in Portsmouth, one of the first things he does is get involved in a fist fight.
Yeah,
but he's actually defending a woman who's being beaten by her husband. So he's doing it for the right reasons, and it seems most of the fights he got involved with were for the right reasons. Yeah. But nevertheless, he sees this in himself, and I'm sure it's put into this character and just flipped. And he doesn't try and excuse himself from McVittie. He doesn't try and say I was in the right. It is almost like, yes, my temper just got the better of me, and I nearly killed this guy. So it's slightly different.
It is. It's an interesting point that one of our patrons, Mark Chatterton, made, is the fact that there's the Birmingham connection again, and Conan Doyle, we know, had been in medical practice with Reginald Radcliffe Hall in Birmingham. There's also the fact that this inheritance, Conan Doyle's mother had recently come into an inheritance too, because Dickie Doyle had died in 1883 as well. So those things might well be sort of circulating as he's writing this story too.
Well, Conan Doyle makes a point, doesn't he, in one of his letters about how much Dickie Doyle's diary sold for. I think it's £200.
Yeah, that's right.
Where the money went, he doesn't say. But I presume it's gone into the family somewhere.
He says that she's going to get her 50. So, it's been split up. But yes, that's right. And then we get into a bit more of his very dark and melancholy thoughts as well. And he says things like, I dislike my fellow mortals. Justice compels me to add that they appear for the most part to dislike me. I hate their little crawling ways, their conventionalities, their deceits, their narrow rights and wrongs. And then it says, they take offence at my brusque outspokenness. What a surprise. So yes, he's an acquired taste, I should think. But then we get into actually where he's relocated, because the great gift of his uncle McVittie is that he has this very isolated, remote part of Scotland, the very northern tip of mainland Scotland. And that has many echoes of other stories that we've seen here. It's one of the first echoes of several of Stevenson's works in this story in particular, I think.
Yeah, I mean, again, the one of the main influences on this story is, we discussed this when we talked about The Great Shadow, is the Pavilion on the Links, which Conan Doyle first read, I think, in 1882.
Yes.
and really enthused about, and it really got to him, that story, and its echoes are found in various stories later on, as I say, with the Great Shadow, John Barrington Cowell's, which we discussed a few shows back, even Surgeon of Gastafel, Mystery of Cloomber. All of these have echoes of that story. This one I feel is very strong. Again, what we've been talking about with the misanthropy of the character.
Yeah.
Because the two leads in Pavilion on the Links, Frank Cassilis and his friend Northmore, both kind of affect to disdain humanity. And in the end, there's this kind of semi-humorous aside that Stevenson puts in. But we were really just a pair of sulky fellows, and I think you've got that with Doyle as well. And as I say, he injects the humour.
Yes, he does
in a similar way, and deflates this, and I think he's picked that up from Stevenson. So the Stevenson element is there, and there are other stories, as we'll go on to discuss later in this story. Stevenson stories like The Wrecker. And The Merry Men, very strong influences.
Yeah, The Wrecker in particular, I think. Yeah. So McVittie has not only inherited this remote tract of land, he's also got enough money essentially to pursue his interests, and these are really quite interesting. Again, it put me in mind of Gastafel. We've mentioned a couple of times this fact that James Upperton is able to seek out an isolated place for his study, and he has that peculiar two-room dwelling where he has one of his rooms is this kind of esoteric den. But the other person it put me in mind of was Raffles Haw, who we discussed way back in episode 1. McVittie says, "I was working in my own little groove and making progress. I have reason to believe that Dalton's atomic theory is founded upon error, and I know that mercury is not an element." So, but if you think back to Raffles Haw is about a chap who discovers the secrets of alchemy by passing a strong electrical current through atoms to basically cause them to lose their atomic mass and change form. And he has many similar kind of questions about this. Raffles Haw, of course, would be later, is 1891. It's a later character, but I think that you get an echo of McVittie appearing in Raffles Haw then as well.
Yeah, I mean, these sort of characters, as I say, are going through his fiction at this time, and again, I don't understand, and I think you're not supposed to understand what John McVittie is trying to do here.
No, I don't think so.
You just get the impression he's just tinkering.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't seem to be writing some great treatise, or because he despises mankind so much, he's just doing all this almost for his own fun. But because he's working on his own, he has, he's down his own groove. He's not getting information from fellow workers in this field, and this pomposity thing comes in very much with that, and that he's just dismissed. He thinks he's brilliant.
Yeah,
in his
absolutely.
own mind, and he's dismissing. You get this all night. I read Bacon, Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, all those who have pried into what is unknowable. They are all fruitless and empty, barren of result, but prodigal of polysyllables, reminding me of men who, while digging for gold, have turned up many worms and then exhibit them exultantly as being what they sought. So, the pomposity and the arrogance of that phrase is again. It's just you were getting this character through and through, and he's not going to achieve anything.
No, he's not. I mean, I think there is possibly a little bit of a theme emerging here as well, which is this idea of scientific detachment. Because we know that Conan Doyle, this is something that played on him. It was from his experience as a medical student as well, this idea that there is a cold, rational, scientific way of thinking which is alien to human emotion. And so you kind of get the ultimate of that here with McVittie, who is not only is he pursuing these scientific interests or quasi-scientific interests because he's reading Spinoza and other people as well, he's also abstracted himself completely from society. He is as far away from society as he possibly can, apart from his rather wonderful housemaid, Madge, who he describes as a hag.
Again, with the science element as well, I think we've got the point that he's not a trained scientist.
No.
We know he's a lawyer, by
Yeah,
training, and it's also noticeable that all the authorities he's quoting there are way out of date.
exactly.
Mm.
So we get to the first major incident in the story now, which is this shipwreck. And it comes about that one night McVittie is interrupted by his housemaid, the hag Madge, who tells him that there's been a shipwreck and calls for help. And at first he has no intention of going, but he does relent eventually, and he brings back a mysterious woman, but also neglects entirely the male survivors, coolly leaving them to their fate. And we get a sense of his rather peculiar outlook on life here as well. He tells Madge, "Those men out there," I said to myself, "have already gone through half the horrors of death. If they be saved, they will but have to go through the same once more in the space of a few brief years. It's best, therefore, that they should pass away now, since they have suffered that anticipation which is more than the pain of dissolution."
But you also get this whole, he knows the storm is going on. He knows that there's a wreck through Madge, and he does this kind of I turned over in bed and it's nothing to do with me attitude, and then his better nature comes into play, and he leaps into his boat and sails off to try and see what he can do. So you are getting this man not being entirely truthful. He's building
Yes.
up a character.
Mm.
It is this kind of disingenuousness which goes right through this story with him. It's you almost, it's difficult to fathom with what his misanthropy is about, because through his very actions here he's shown his better nature will fight its way through.
Yes, he does. He does, and yeah, he's probably the most unreliable of narrators that Conan Doyle ever produces, and so you're constantly reading this and questioning what is really happening here, because there's, well, right at the end we're going to find out about him saying that he wrote this for his own entertainment. So what is the entertainment he's getting from this story in particular? And it's while he is debating whether or not to go that we get a kind of window into what is perhaps a sense of Conan Doyle's exploration of spiritualism around this time. So McVittie says, "I endeavoured to compose myself to sleep once more, for that philosophy which had taught me to consider death as a small and trivial incident in man's eternal and ever-changing career had also broken me of much curiosity concerning worldly matters." So, we get this sense that, death is just a step on a wider journey. And you get a couple of echoes of this later as well. But it's also, of course, it's very self-serving. I suspect he just didn't want to get out of a warm bed.
Element, and I can't get back to sleep. I must go. Yeah, that fights its way through, which
It does.
To me, it's one of the kind of the key psychological moments in the story that really you begin to get, there is another side to this character.
Yeah, there definitely is.
And he's been protesting rather too much up to this point.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, and he's very much the moral hypocrite as well. He's talking about standing above society, and then he's coolly thinking, well, I'm not going to go and help anybody else. But anyway, we then get the introduction of our first major supporting character, and that is the woman he rescues from the ship. We later learn is called Sophie Ramusine. And this is where I got another sense, another echo of Surgeon of Gastafel, because one of the things that happens in this story and in Gastafel is that you have a female character who is an important agent in the story, but actually is quite passive and ultimately gets replaced by a later character. And this is what's going to happen here, as we shall see. But she's quite a thin, it has to be said, this is not a well-wrought character, is it?
No, I mean, it's she's almost a prop.
Yeah.
In some ways, and it's convenient that she doesn't speak English, so therefore, she doesn't have to have any dialogue with McVittie, and she's just there, and you kind of get this dumb show from her throughout most of this, and it's kind of almost the damsel in distress.
It is.
trope is used here, but we've got this kind of passive female character who McVittie seems to treat with just contempt, almost like she's a rescued kitten.
Yeah.
Or something like that. But then you get this strange moment where she becomes worried for him when he's gone out worried, and he makes the comment, "I had an old revolver with some cartridges which had been thrown away among the rubbish. She found this one day and at once proceeded to clean it and oil it." It's not every sort of damsel in distress who knows how to take a gun to pieces and clean and oil them. So there's something going on more in her character, quite obviously here, and it is a shame she's not developed more, because that suddenly think, what's going on here?
Yeah, she is, I think, as you say, she's a prop in this story, and all we really get from it is a greater sense of his misogyny. Quite astonishing statements in this, where he's actually comparing her to Madge as well. He says it was bad enough to be compelled to have Madge in the house, but she was old and ugly and could be ignored. This one was young and lively and so fashioned as to divert attention from graver things.
Yeah, how dare she divert him from his path, and how dare she kind of almost inflame him. Yeah. Which is what's going on, and it's again he's blaming her for what's within him.
Absolutely. Well, it reminded me of those ridiculous arguments about why women couldn't work in laboratories. when beginning of the 20th century, people saying, well, women shouldn't be scientists because they'll distract men from what they're meant to be doing.
Yes, which is basically arguing how weak men are.
Yeah, exactly right.
And we're getting this very much in this story, which again. It's what is going on in this story, and there is this kind of walking the fence between a serious dark story and the comedy.
Yeah, there is.
And again, this idiotic character.
Yeah.
Who is he will take the blame for some of when he's saying about his temper and so on, but he won't take the blame for this one.
Absolutely. It's an odd name as well, isn't it, Sophie Ramazine?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the origins of that at all. It certainly doesn't sound Russian.
No.
Sophie is sometimes used in literature this time. It is sort of Central and Eastern European. I think, later on in the Idler, which Conan Doyle would go on to write for. In 1893, they had a serial running through, Memoirs of a Female Nihilist by Sophie Vassiliev. And there's also in 1906 Anthony Hope, one of his Ruritanian novels, Sophie of Cravonia. So it seems to be a name that's associated with English or British writers with a slight exoticism.
I was thinking Sophie Cratides from the Greek Interpreter.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Who was also prone to writing things on a piece of paper, or rather somebody else in the story is writing on names on a piece of paper. But Sophie's not the only person to have survived this shipwreck, and we are now introduced to the next character, the titular character, the man from Archangel, who we discover is called Urganef.
Yeah, we're first introduced to him in the wreck, and he's as McVittie's watching this unfold before him, he's looking at the ship and sees one particular character stood in. He was a tall man who stood apart from the others, balancing himself upon the swaying wreck as though he disdained to cling on to rope or bulwark. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his head was sunk upon his breast. But even in that despondent attitude there was a litheness and decision in his pose, and in every motion which marked him as a man little likely to yield to despair. So we're getting him set straight up as this is a strong man. And as I was reading, there's a curious similarity to one of Conan Doyle's slightly later stories, 1888, The Mystery of Clumber. Again set on the Scottish coast, again involving a shipwreck in a storm.
Indeed.
And in that we have three Buddhists stood on the deck of the ship unconcerned. It's very, very similar. So Doyle obviously liked this idea. It's a good way of setting up kind of strong and mysterious characters.
Killer Buddhists, no less.
Oh, killer Buddhists, very yes, and not very accurate Buddhists in other ways. But yes, so we've got this great drama, and as we've said before, it's very Stevensonian.
Oh, very.
The whole setup of the storm and the wreck, and then McVittie's distracted by his rescue of Sophie, and this he assumes Sophie is the only survivor, but he is wrong. And he encounters this man who survives the wreck and is staying with some local fishermen and is staking out McVittie's house.
Yes.
So again, we're back to the pavilion and the links with Frank Cassilis, and he's living like a gypsy.
Yeah.
At the start, very artistic, and his appearance is very gypsy-like.
Yes.
And then when we see Oganov, he's described, his complexion was dark, with black hair and short curling beard, a hawk-like nose and golden earrings in his ears, the general effect being wild and somewhat noble. He wore a faded velveteen jacket, a red flannel shirt, and high sea boots coming halfway up his thighs. So it is very piratical.
It is indeed.
Sort of character who would stand out a little bit in these surroundings. So we've got this character. He's set up as, the very exotic, very very tough. This is a very masculine character.
Yes. Yeah, and another sort of romantic gothic type thrown in as well. I mean, as well as Stevenson, I do wonder if there's a nod here to Clark Russell as well. Mm-hmm. So we know from the 5 Orange Pips that Watson is a great fan of Clark Russell's fine sea stories, but he was always a great one for shipwrecks, and in particular his kind of breakthrough novel was The Wreck of the Grosvenor in 1877, and that's an interesting one in that the character, there's this sort of second mate who is serving under a very brutal captain, and there are elements of that brutal captain, I think, coming through in this lead character here as well, and that again has the story of a woman coming into the mix too. They're all playing on kind of archetypes, aren't they? They're all playing on...
and we'll get this in the next decade, but notably in Bram Stoker's fiction. The Mystery of the Sea, and Dracula, of course, with The Wreck of the Demeter at Whitby. It's using the same sort of tropes and same setups. It always works in this sort of fiction, as long as it's well done. And Doyle has learned from the best with Stevenson.
Yes, definitely. And then we get this rather bizarre interchange when Urkanev and McVittie meet, which again is sort of points to our unreliable narrator bit. So McVittie says, "Hello," I said in an aggrieved voice. "You got ashore all right then?" "Yes," he answered in good English. "It was no doing of mine. The waves threw me up. I wish to God I'd been allowed to drown. 2 good fishermen who live round yonder point pulled me out and cared for me. Yet I could not honestly thank them for it. Ho, ho, thought I, here is a man of my own kidney." But it's very self-serving, isn't it? Because essentially what he's saying is that, I was right not to rescue this man, because actually he didn't really want to be rescued at the end. He wanted to die this noble, heroic death on the coast.
But he also finds out, I think, in one of their exchanges, he's a very perspicacious character. He's got McVittie.
Yeah,
he understands them, and he says to him at one point, "No doubt you are kind and gentle too, in spite of your roughness." He's seen underneath the cover,
yes,
and he sees through him straight away and says, this guy, he's playing this character, and Urganov's knocked round the world,
yes,
and seen all types and conditions of men. And he can size McVittie up pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And McVittie won't like that. He won't like being told he's good and nice.
No, he definitely won't. And we come to learn a bit more about Urganev later in the story. But just to pick it up here, we later discover he's a Finn.
Yeah, I mean, we get we found out about his nationality again when he's talking to McVittie and says, "I am a Finn by birth, but I've spent my life in every part of the world."
Mm.
So you've got that. There's no point where he's talking, about being Russian.
Mm.
And as you said, at this time, Finland is a kind of semi-autonomous region
Yeah.
of Russia, and I got a book from 1882, The Russian Empire, Historical and Descriptive, by John McVittie. So this is contemporaneous
Yeah.
with this story, and the kind of thing that Doyle might have been looking in for information. And Geddy says, like Poland, though part of the Tsar's European dominions, it is outside of Russia.
Mm.
It has its peculiar language, religion, and nationality, all presenting strong marks of contrast to the prevalent Russian type, and it has a separate organisation and special laws.
Mm.
It's more akin to the Scandinavian countries, in its way, and particularly Sweden, and its religion is Lutheran,
Yes.
so it hasn't got the Orthodox religion of Russia. So it is very different.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that whole thing about it being the other, this is another example of Conan Doyle's obsession at this time, and actually for many years to come, about foreign interlopers and bringing with them threats or dangers, or in this case, McVittie's life is just being upended by these two individuals turning up on his doorstep. But there's also a sense in which he's conjuring with the obsession with Russian nihilists, which we've talked about previously, but sort of stem really from that assassination of Alexander II in 1881, and then the British popular press and fiction indeed becomes sort of obsessed with nihilist plots. We talked previously about Oscar Wilde's play Vera, which was suppressed, wasn't it? That was about 1880, I think. But then we have Henry James' novel The Princess Casamassima in 1886, so the year after this, which is about a London radical who's drawn into an assassination plot. And then people like G.A. Henty, the great boy's own adventure writer, would write Condemned as a Nihilist in 1892 about an English student in Russia who's seduced by a nihilist woman. And so you do start to get in popular fiction as well around this time the idea of this kind of seductive lady nihilist as well. And all of this is feeding in, isn't it?
Yeah, it's in the culture in a big way. At this time there's an influx of Russian émigrés.
Yeah.
Come over from the pogroms, particularly Jewish émigrés come over, and there's a fearful attitude towards them, and as you say, it is the other. So you've got the émigrés coming in. You've got amongst them this fear of mixed in of various types of politicals and terrorists, and also watching them agents from the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana.
Yeah.
And this got mixed up with the whole Jack the Ripper thing in 1888. Yes. The whole fear got mixed into that. But like you say, there's also in fiction that serial in the Idler, 1893, Memoirs of a Female Nihilist.
Yeah.
You've got this Doyle himself, right? So, Night Among the Nihilists this time, and An Exciting Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
Both of which tie into this. Lord Arthur Savile's Crime, another. The Wilde did Vera, but he also wrote that. That ties into this. Under Western Eyes, Joseph Conrad.
Yeah.
So this is big, and with Doyle again, we've just been doing something on the Six Napoleons, where you have Morse Hudson worried about nihilists and anarchists and so on. The Golden Pince-Nez.
Yeah.
Got nihilism mixed in that. So it's really, it is a major thing in the culture. And although we don't get Sophie and Alexis being, we don't get any expression that they are nihilists. But I do, as I've said before, I find it interesting that Sophie knows how to strip and clean a gun.
Yeah.
That's very suggestive to me.
Yeah, I think there is more than a hint in here that this is what's going on. But yeah, you got all of these things playing in, and it's part of the exotic, isn't it, as well? That's what he's playing on. It's the othering of these individuals from well, he's saying Russia, but as he said, he's actually from Finland, and Sophie's name is not particularly Russian either.
Well, his is quite. The other thing that's starting to come in at this sort of time is the interest in Russian literature.
Yeah.
So we've got Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev.
Turgenev.
And we know that Doyle was interested in Turgenev's work. And
Yeah.
you've got here this character called Orgenov, or is it Orgenev? Put a T in front of it, you got Turgen. So is that where Doyle's getting the name from here?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
But it's all this is all swirling around in the culture at this time.
But the key point that we learn from Turgenev is that he wants Sophie back. He's realised that she survived. She's staying with McVittie, and McVittie puts his foot down about this. He says, "I don't want this wench here. I wish I'd never seen her. If she died, it would be no grief to me. But as to handing her over to you when it's clear she fears and hates you, I won't do." And that sort of speaks to his great pride, which ultimately is what he says is the reason why he prevents her from being returned to Turgenev. But I mean, this is all part of that unreliable narrator.
Absolutely. I mean, it feels like a peculiar love triangle that's going on here.
Very peculiar, yeah. So that's the initial meeting. But then things quieten down in the McVittie household, such as it is, with Madge the hag and and Sophie. And Sophie's trying to get into his good books. I think she appears in the laboratory and sits at the side very quietly, and then she starts to help with some of his experiments, whatever on earth these experiments are, supposedly. He does say at one point, she was wonderfully nimble-fingered and natty in all domestic duties, which must have been nice for him. But then we get the return of Turgenev, and there is this rather wonderful description of him when McVittie one day spots him. He says, it was he, the Russian. He squatted there like a gigantic toad, with his legs doubled under him in strange Mongolian fashion, and his eyes fixed apparently upon the window of the room in which the young girl and the housekeeper slept. The light fell upon his upturned face, and I saw once more the hawk-like grace of his countenance, with the single deeply indented line of care upon his brow, and the protruding beard which marks the passionate nature. So there you go, Paul, you've got some endorsement for your beard.
Does it protrude? But I mean, it's an interesting quote, that as well, because what we didn't mention earlier with McVittie and the misanthropic side of his character is that is also reflected later on in Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, that's right.
That you've got this, what do the great British public, what do they care about? And his disparaging of all and sundry when he's in the mood. But we've also got with this hawk-like nose of Turgenev as well, and the watching, the patience. This very sort of Holmes, very detective, very I'm staking out his man. So you've got that element coming in here as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in this where Conan Doyle is playing with types of narrator, and you can see aspects of this character both in kind of the scientific rationalism, the sort of downplaying of human emotion, the misogyny that all plays into Sherlock Holmes at a later date. And not too far after this, obviously, because he's writing 1885, 86 around the time that this has come out. In fact, McVittie does, after he spots Turgenev, he actually comes back later and meets him properly, but only after he's been out for a late night. His head was aching partly from prolonged stooping and partly from the effects of a noxious drug, which I had inhaled the night before, which is another...
And another side to McVittie's character, which caught me as I was reading the story, when he's talking about his dislike of the human race, and where he talks about, they take offence at my brusque outspokenness, my disregard for their social laws, my impatience of all constraint, and then goes on to say, among my books and my drugs, in my lonely den at Mancy, I could let the great drove of the human race pass onwards with their politics and inventions and tittle-tattle, and I remain behind stagnant and happy. But my drugs, it's very ambiguous.
Yeah, it is.
Does he mean the chemicals he's working with?
Yeah.
or does he mean recreational drugs? And that he does mention later on, he talks about having cast many a wistful, doubtful glance at my opium bottle.
Yeah.
Which is very suggestive. So we've also got that aspect of McVittie's character coming in there. And again, this unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
If he's taking opium or taking drugs, it just adds to that unreliability.
Yeah. The other thing that this reminded me of was, on a lighter side, was Conan Doyle's self-administering of gelseminum, where he decided to have a play around with it and had to stop with the self-experiments when he ended up going to the toilet for about a day, I think. So that was hopefully not what McVittie was on with. But then you get here a second confrontation with Turgenev, and going back to one of the points that you made, Paul, about the fact that the Finn has got a good sense of McVittie's character. McVittie stands his ground and says that he's not going to pass over Sophie. But Turgenev says, "You're a very strange man," he said at last. "I cannot understand you. You still stand between me and Sophie." He's very blunt in basically saying, "Look, none of this makes sense. What you're saying here does not make sense."
And this whole theme of unreliable narrator, we do get towards the end. Turgenev saying to McVittie, giving his background and the whole thing with Sophie, who he'd known in Russia, and she was they weren't married.
No.
But it was understood that he was going to be her husband, but because he's off, sailing around the world all the time, this is when this kind of there's a seducer. Enters the scene, and when Turgenev comes back and he finds out Sophie's about to get married to the seducer, and so Turgenev gets a gang of his likely lads, and they move into the church, and basically I think it's almost at the altar, isn't it?
Yeah,
they
that's right.
Go in and kidnap Sophie.
Yeah.
From the young seducer, and sail off with her.
Yeah.
And then this is the expedition that ends up in Caithness, coming to an unfortunate end. So that's the story that Turgenev tells. Now, how convincing it is, I don't know really, because the whole thing sounds just a romantic nonsense and highly implausible.
Yes. Well, I think this is the point at which the story starts to move more into a kind of romantic Gothic tradition, more obviously, as we get towards the end of this. And I wouldn't say it comes off the rails, but it certainly feels like it's changing tone. For his part, McVittie is very dismissive of Turgenev's story, isn't he? He says, I'm tired of your story. For my part, I think you're a great fool. If you imagine that this love of yours will pass away, you'd best amuse yourself as best you can until it does. If, on the other hand, it's a fixed thing, you cannot do better than cut your throat, for that is the shortest way out of it. And from here on in, we're into the final act, and again, some time has passed. McVittie is out on the waterfront. The weather worsens. He decides to head home, and as he turns the corner, he sees Turgenev taking Sophie from the house. I uttered a wild cry of impotent anger and stamped up and down the sands like a maniac, which does not sound this kind of aloof individual who doesn't have any investment in Sophie or indeed what's going on here. My heart was untouched, but my pride, there I had been cruelly wounded. So again, we get this sense of actually what is sticking in his craw, as it were. And then they disappear at that point.
Yeah, we have this very dramatic scene. It's almost the caveman taking his bride,
yes,
as it were. And by the time McVittie gets to the coast, they I think they've sailed off in his dinghy. That's right. Has taken that off and taken Sophie with him, and he bows to McVittie.
He does,
and it doesn't seem it's a bow of mockery. It seems it's a genuine a genuine gesture. And then they disappear, and there's another storm. And then after that, they reappear.
Mm.
And first McVittie sees his boat on the beach, and then he sees another dark shape, and I saw at a glance that it was the Russian, face downwards and dead. I rushed into the water and dragged him up onto the beach. It was only when I turned him over that I discovered that she was beneath him, his dead arms encircling her, his mangled body still intervening between her and the fury of the storm.
Mm.
So it's all very, this is conventional romantic stuff. We suddenly got at the end of the story after all this kind of rather dark and odd shenanigans.
Yes, and McVittie says there were signs which led me to believe that during that awful night, the woman's fickle mind had come at last to learn the worth of the true heart and strong arm which struggled for her and guarded her so tenderly. And eventually McVittie decides he's going to bury the pair of them together on the coast, and you get the quite remarkable line: empires may rise and may fall, dynasties may perish, great wars may come and go, but heedless of it all, those two shall embrace each other forever, and I in their lonely shrine by the side of the sounding ocean, which is a remarkable liberty for him to take, having now decided that these two were actually intended for each other in eternity, as it were. Despite everything that he's heard to this date, which is why ultimately this, we have to ask the question: what really is going on in this story?
Because there's numerous peculiarities. I mean, one is here he is talking about this the Russian's great heart and so on. Whereas all he's done is confront him throughout the whole story, and almost seen him off as a blackguard.
Yeah.
And then suddenly we have this change of attitude, and also the fact that none of them have alerted the authorities.
No.
That there's been a wreck. That this has gone on. That we had 2 survivors. There's one point where he talks about the Russian consul in Edinburgh, but doesn't do anything about it. And then he does this illegal burial at the end.
Yeah, it's very peculiar. So, I mean, what do you think is actually going on here at the end of this story then?
I mean, because it's all so, all of it's unreliable, and who's telling the truth? Is anybody telling the truth? Probably not. I just find the kind of the wedding idea, and as say Turgenev and his friends kidnapping Sophie, and then in some big romantic gesture, and then sailing off into the sunset kind of thing. The whole thing. If you read Charles Hyam's biography of Doyle, and Hyam has particular obsessions, and he goes this story, and he's talking about the sexual undercurrents of this story, and I think he's quite right. That's there, but I think there's also political undercurrents which really never really surface. And you just wonder, as I've said with Turgenev and Sophie, whether these are nihilists or is he a Finn nationalist?
Yeah.
You could work all sorts of ideas onto him, and that she has been part of the gang or something, because it's this whole thing. The fact she knows about guns. Yeah. Really is an oddity to me that kind of points to something in her character that we're not being told about. And I just wonder, later on in the Golden Pince-Nez, we had this thing with Professor Coram and Anna, where she's been a young disciple of his and she's turned against him. Yeah. And you just wonder if that's what's going on here.
That's where my head went. Was very much that. I mean, that, and the other more extreme one is that McVittie is just lying entirely. These two chanced upon his house and he murdered them. Because I wouldn't put it past him, to be perfectly honest. But I prefer your theory. I prefer your theory that they are pupil and master, as it were, and have come to an altercation. But I think this goes to the heart of why I think Conan Doyle may well have, if we are to believe Adrian, may well have regarded this story so highly, because it is ambiguous. And it's one of the things that I think marks his evolution as a writer, that he's comfortable writing something at this point in his career where you're not doing all the heavy lifting for the audience as the author. You are leaving it deliberately vague, and you're allowing the themes to express themselves. It is, as you say, it's very Stevensonian.
Oh, absolutely, and I agree with you there. I think there's a kernel of truth certainly in what Adrian says, that his father will have regarded it highly. Whether he regarded it as his finest story, I don't know, but it's something where, as you say, Doyle himself might have recognised that this is and if he pushed it on the Cornhill or tried it on the Cornhill, I think he thought it was certainly worthy of the Cornhill, and up to the standard of it certainly is of J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement.
Yes,
that it would have fitted rather well. Probably more into there than in London society.
Oh yes,
but it is, as you say, very Stevensonian. It's a psychological, more psychologically deft, because as you say, we're doing who are these characters? He's making the audience, he's making you think, and this whole game he's playing with this story, and the fact that it's got this humorous element thrown in as well. Which Stevenson was always very strong on.
Yes.
I think it really is it is a step forward, and particularly from you look at the kind of the Bret Hart influenced earlier stories. It's a real step on from those.
Yeah, it is. I think also Conan Doyle may well have been thinking about the prose style, because I think this is probably the floweriest he ever gets in his prose style. There are long descriptive sections in this story that are pretty unusual, I would say, for Conan Doyle. He doesn't tend to be quite so, I hate to use the word laborious, but sort of, it certainly has a slower pace at times than other stories, because he is rather more weighed down with the description, and it's beautiful description. Some of the passages about the coastline and the weather are fantastic, but you can feel that this is an element of his style that he decides to prune after this point. And the other is that, I do wonder about this central narrator, because he is an unconventional character. He's a dislikable character, but there are traits in him that may well have been ones that Conan Doyle shared. And I know we have to be very careful not to put Conan Doyle into every story he wrote, but certainly you mentioned before, he was a bit handy with his fists. We knew he had a bit of a temper, but also he does have a kind of darkly melancholic side to him.
Oh yeah,
and he can be very introspective, and he does have, as we know from spiritualism, he goes on to think very deeply about some of the biggest questions in life. So in a strange way, the narrator does not feel that far from Conan Doyle, in the sense that you get the public Conan Doyle, and then every now and then you get the glimpse of the private Conan Doyle. And I do wonder if some of the private Conan Doyle is leaking into this in the same way as you get in James Upperton in The Surgeon of Gaster Fell.
And this is a very it's a time of transition in his life. He's setting himself up as in his new medical practice, as you say. Louisa Hawkins is on the horizon. You've got all of that starting to come up, and there's memories still of his the Plymouth misadventure.
Yes,
with Bud, talk about these odd characters who he's met, and all of that is going to be swirling around. So I think we've got this wonderful blend here. And I'd just like to pick up on a point you made there about the Doyle himself being the character. There is one illustration for a French publication of this story, which shows Turgenev, kidnapping Sophie for the second time, as it were, and McVittie running along the beach towards them, and McVittie is drawn as Conan Doyle,
yes,
unmistakably.
He is. Well, I mean, I think the story, whether Conan Doyle really felt it was his favourite or not, it certainly feels like one of those pivotal stories, doesn't it? I mean, there are moments in his career where he writes something that it feels like he's made a step change. And, before this, I think you've probably got Captain of the Pole Star. You have this. Afterwards, you're going to get Micah Clarke. You're going to get A Scandal in Bohemia. There are certain stories, I feel like they have a kind of gravitational pull to them, and around them a lot of things circulate, and so I would probably put this as one of those landmarks in his writing career, in his evolution.
And I think this is partly one of the reasons why, there are obviously various reasons with Mysteries and Adventures, the book that Hogg puts out before Conan Doyle does The Captain of the Pole Star. I think what really annoys Conan Doyle is the fact that some of the stories in it, like The Man from Archangel, that he really does regard highly, he's very irritated that Hogg is publishing them in his own. It's not a pirate anthology because Hogg actually has the rights to these.
That's right.
But nevertheless, it's done without Doyle's permission. And Doyle would probably have said, if he was going to allow anything, you can do the earlier stories, the Bret Hart type stories. But Doyle would have wanted, these later ones where he can recognise his own advances in style. I think that would have irked him.
Yeah, that's right, because he does start to, from The Captain of the Pole Star and Other Tales, he's actively curating and suppressing to some extent things that he's written that he's uncomfortable with, or frankly doesn't feel a worthy reflection of his talent at that time. So that brings us to the end of our discussion of The Man from Archangel. If you want to find out more about that story, then you can read the show notes at doingsofdoyle.com. And please also check out the opportunity to become a patron on Patreon or PayPal, and you can find the details at the website as well. So, Paul, what are we looking at next month?
Well, we've been looking at a slightly gothic story today, but it's kind of gothic adventure mixed together what we've been looking at today. But next month we're going into the gothic and ghostly, back into that realm with a very fascinating little ghost story, the story of the Brown Hand.
Very unconventional ghost story. Excellent. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. Now, the man from
Man from Uncle.
Somebody had to do it, didn't they? The Man from Uncle at some point. Oh dear.